together. Oh, maybe we don't have to stop it. Okay. Okay, wrist flexion and then extension.
For wrist flexion, we're testing the flexor carpi radialis and the flexor carpi ulnaris.
Radialis.
Ulnaris. Okay, so the patient's going to be sitting with their forearm supinated on the table, and the therapist is going to support the forearm under the wrist. And to test for both wrist flexors at once, the therapist is going to ask the patient to flex their hand up towards the ceiling. If they can do that without any resistance, that would be a 3. And that tests both the flexor carpi ulnaris and radialis at the same time. To test each one individually, you're going to ask the patient to flex their wrist in a radial deviation with the thumb leading.
And you can feel the...
Well, we're not there yet. No. And then for the ulnaris, you do the same thing but leading with the pinky. Okay, so if they can do all of those, then that would be a 3. To test for a 4 or a 5, you would, for both the radialis and ulnaris, you'd resist against all metacarpals. So if you can flex against that, that would be a 5. Against a little less would be a 4. To test for just the radialis, you would apply resistance just over the second metacarpal. And if they can do that, then that would be a 5, and against a little less would be a 4. To test the ulnaris, you would resist against the 5th metacarpal. Okay, against maximal resistance would be a 5, and a little less would be a 4. So if the patient was unable to complete the range of motion without any resistance, then you would place the form halfway between pronation and supination, and the therapist would support again under the wrist and ask the patient to flex their wrist. And if they can do that without gravity, then that would be a 2. A 1 would be back with the arms supinated, and if you can feel any contraction on either the flexor carpi radialis or ulnaris, then that would be a 1, and if there was no contraction at all, then that would be a 0, and there are no substitutions.
Now wrist extension.
Okay, for wrist extension, we're testing the extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis and the extensor carpi ulnaris. So the patient's going to be sitting with the forearm fully pronated on the table, and the therapist is going to stabilize underneath the wrist. To test all 3 of the muscles, the patient is going to extend the wrist without any deviation.
3.
If they can do that, that would be a 3. Okay. To test for a 4 or 5, the patient would apply resistance over the metacarpals. And if the patient could extend their wrist against maximal resistance, that would be a 5. Against some resistance would be a 4. If the patient was unable to extend their wrist against gravity without any resistance, then you would test for a 2. And you would put the forearm in a neutral position, again supporting the patient's wrist. And you'd ask the patient to extend their wrist, and if they can do that, then that would be a 2 with gravity eliminated. To test for a 1, you'd again, put their hand pronated again, and you'd feel for the extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis, and the extensor carpi ulnaris. If there's any contractile activity in these muscles, then that would be a 1, and if there's no contraction at all, then that would be a 0.
You hold here and here for the extensor radialis, carpi radialis. Where would you hold?
Oh, you would
Feel
just
it.
pump. Just right above the wrist here.
Okay. That would be 2.
One.
If you feel it.
Yeah, and no contraction at all would be a 0. And the most common substitution is allowing the finger extensors to substitute. So make sure that their fingers are relaxed when doing the test and that they're not fully extending them up.